The galaxy had grown complacent, lulled into a sense of permanence by the unchallenged might of the Vorkan Empire. For over 12,000 standard cycles, the Emperor's dominion had stretched across hundreds of star systems, a living lattice of power and terror that no one dared to question. His fleets were titanic, each vessel the size of cities, bristling with weapons that could obliterate entire worlds in a single strike. His armadas moved like living storms across the void, subspace corridors trembling under the weight of their passage. And at the heart of it all sat the Emperor himself, a being whose arrogance had long since become law, whose voice alone could command planets to surrender and fleets to annihilate without hesitation. In his eyes, the galaxy existed solely to be ruled, conquered, or burned into obedience. Yet, in the quiet edges of the spiral arms, far from the golden light of the core, a murmur began to stir, a whisper of a species long dismissed as primitive, a species whose home system had been considered an inconsequential backwater: humans. Reports trickled in from border colonies, carried on trembling communications networks by terrified scouts, merchants, and scientists alike. They spoke of strange vessels emerging from the Sol system, small, seemingly fragile ships, yet moving with precision, speed, and coordination no one had ever witnessed from a species so young. These Terrans, as they were called, were said to be intelligent, bold, and dangerously unpredictable. The Empire's governors dismissed the reports at first, laughing nervously behind their datapads. Yet the Emperor, hearing these whispers, felt the flicker of curiosity and amusement. How quaint, he thought. Primitive bipedal creatures, barely grasping interstellar travel, imagining they could challenge the might of the Vorkan. His amusement grew into mockery. He had commanded fleets that could annihilate whole clusters of stars. He had crushed rebellions before they even began. And yet, he found himself strangely intrigued. He allowed the Terrans' movements to be monitored, their signals intercepted, their designs scrutinized. Perhaps it was his arrogance, perhaps his boredom, but he chose to watch them, to see just how laughable this threat might be. The Terrans approached the outer rim under conditions he considered ludicrous. A dying sun bathed the system in unstable radiation, its orbit irregular and unpredictable, a field of gravitational eddies that would have unnerved even the most disciplined Vorkan navigators. But the humans moved with uncanny elegance. Their formations shifted constantly, like living organisms adapting to their environment, exploiting the very chaos that the Emperor had assumed would make them vulnerable. His screens filled with intricate patterns, spirals, weaving loops, sudden surges that defied all prediction. The humans weren't merely approaching, they were dancing through death. And the Emperor, watching from his obsidian throne room aboard his flagship, felt the first prick of unease. In his hubris, he broadcast his contempt across subspace. His voice, amplified and distorted to convey the full weight of his imperial authority, echoed to every listening system. Fools of Earth, you crawl in the dust of stars. Your weapons are toys, your courage a jest. Be gone before my wrath annihilates your world and erases your memory from the galaxy. He expected fear, expected retreat, expected the small, quivering response of an insignificant species recognizing its place. But the Terrans did not respond the way he imagined. They did not flinch. They did not cower. Instead, they pressed forward, unmoved, their ships weaving through gravitational hazards with precision that was almost supernatural. Then the engagement began. The Emperor's fleet unleashed a torrent of firepower, massive energy lances cutting through space, planetary annihilators calibrated to perfection, beams designed to melt entire squadrons in seconds. And yet, time and again, the humans evaded, exploiting weaknesses in targeting algorithms, using gravitational anomalies and radiation pockets as shields, and turning chaos into a weapon of their own. The Emperor roared in frustration, his contempt turning into fury. His dreadnoughts, the pride of his empire, were struggling to track vessels smaller than most moons, moving with a coordination that defied centuries of military doctrine. The first Vorkon ship fell not from a direct strike, but from internal collapse. Its energy matrix, destabilized by unseen interference, shattered silently, leaving only floating debris in the void. Panic rippled through the Emperor's admirals. This had never happened. No species had ever been able to breach their defensive assumptions with such precision, such speed, such audacity. Yet the humans were not merely surviving. They were actively dismantling the Emperor's empire with a meticulous intelligence that bordered on genius. Each maneuver, each attack was perfectly calculated, yet executed with improvisational flair that made predictability impossible. The Terrans did not simply fight, they adapted, observed, and exploited, rewriting the rules of engagement in real time. As the dying sun cast its blood-red light over the outer system, the Emperor realized the gravity of his miscalculation. His arrogance had blinded him to a species that thought differently, that adapted relentlessly, that valued ingenuity as highly as firepower. The Terrans' approach was methodical, their strategy flawless, their courage absolute. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor understood that he was facing not just a fleet, but an intelligence, a force that could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the most advanced civilization the galaxy had ever known. By the time the first night fell across the Vorkon outer rim, the seeds of ruin had already taken root. What had begun as mockery was on the verge of becoming history. A small, underestimated species from a backwater system was about to prove that the stars belonged to those who dared, not to those who assumed dominion. Night had fallen across the outer rim, but the darkness of space was far from empty. It was a theater of war, and the Terrans were the unseen choreographers of chaos. The Emperor's fleet, once a symbol of unchallengeable dominance, now quivered under the weight of a reality it had never known. His dreadnoughts, massive enough to house entire cities, staggered as if alive, crippled not by firepower, but by an invisible hand manipulating their every move. Communications failed. Targeting arrays went haywire, and navigation systems spun in impossible loops. The humans had turned precision, patience, and unpredictability into a weapon, a blade honed on the very arrogance of the Vorkon. The Emperor, watching from his obsidian throne on the flagship Oblivion's crown, could feel the first tendrils of doubt creeping into his mind. For all his centuries of conquest, he had never faced an enemy that moved so unpredictably. The Terrans' fleet was small, yes, by imperial standards, but every vessel was a node in a network of ingenuity. One human frigate would dart into the gravitational eddy near a dying sun. Another would slip through the radiation belt that had destabilized countless Vorkon ships in the past, and yet another would infiltrate the space around a patrol station, manipulating its sensors to create phantom targets. It was not brute force, it was elegance. The Emperor roared at his admirals, demanding answers, strategies, countermeasures, but there were none. The humans had rewritten the battlefield while he had been preoccupied with mocking them. Every attempt to unleash the Emperor's superior technology only deepened the crisis. Planetary annihilators, designed to melt continents in seconds, were neutralized by subtle shifts in the Terrans' flight patterns. Massive energy lances that could pierce shields miles thick misfired, their beams collapsing into the emptiness of space. Entire squadrons, pristine in their formation, flickered into nothingness as the Terrans deployed devices that disrupted energy matrices and gravitational stabilizers. Ships that had survived countless battles now became tombs, their crews trapped in the unforgiving silence of the void. Panic, a sensation long foreign to the Emperor's mind, spread through his officers. They had never been powerless. They had never been outsmarted. And now, against creatures they had called primitive, they were failing spectacularly. The Terrans' ingenuity extended beyond mere engineering. They understood chaos as a tool. Where the Emperor's sensors expected order, they imposed complexity. Their vessels moved in ways that mirrored natural phenomena, solar flares, asteroid clusters, magnetic eddies, rendering the Vorkan's targeting algorithms ineffective. And where he anticipated linear assaults, the humans employed spirals, loops, sudden bursts of acceleration, always staying just beyond the lethal edge of Imperial firepower. In every engagement, they learned, adapted, and countered faster than any Vorkan system could respond. The humans were not simply fighting, they were teaching the galaxy a lesson in what intelligence combined with courage could achieve. By the second cycle of the dying sun, the Emperor's confidence had begun to fracture. His fleet, though vast, was a collapsing web, each strand severed by unseen hands. Fire erupted on orbital platforms, not from direct hits, but from chain reactions triggered by Terran interference. Supply lines failed as stealth ships neutralized entire convoys, and command signals were corrupted, leaving entire fleets paralyzed in the void. The Emperor's voice, once a beacon of absolute authority, now carried frustration and disbelief. He had mocked the humans, and yet they had survived. And more than that, they had turned his mockery into a blueprint for their victory. The human's true brilliance became evident in the moments when he sought to counterattack. Every maneuver he ordered, every flanking strategy, every attempt to overwhelm with numbers was anticipated. The Terrans did not rely on repetition. They relied on observation, adaptation, and the subtle application of physics in ways no alien had thought to exploit. A Vorkan dreadnought would lunge forward to intercept, only to find itself ensnared in a localized gravitational distortion. Energy beams fired in anger would collapse before reaching their target, rerouted by interference grids the Terrans had deployed decades earlier. It was as if the humans could see into the future, predict intent, and exploit it in 1,000 different ways. And then the Emperor's capital systems trembled. Fires consumed cities he had considered impregnable. Civilian stations, starports, orbital cities, all vulnerable and all falling. Panic spread among the Vorkan citizens. Their Emperor's words, once a source of reassurance and fear, had become meaningless against a species whose cunning defied comprehension. It was not mere firepower that was devastating the Empire. It was intellect, courage, and relentless determination. And the humans, moving like shadows against a dying sun, pressed onward with calm precision. By the end of the night cycle, the Emperor's greatest pride, his fleet, his cities, his subjects' unquestioning loyalty, was reduced to chaos and ruin, leaving a single terrifying truth. The Terrans were not just a threat. They were a force that could reshape the galaxy, one calculated strike at a time. The Emperor, seated upon the obsidian throne in the silent command chamber, finally recognized what centuries of conquest had never taught him. Arrogance could be shattered, empires could fall, and no amount of power could withstand the ingenuity of a species unwilling to bow. By the time the first light of the dying sun touched the remnants of his outer systems, the Emperor's laughter had vanished. What remained was fear, confusion, and the bitter realization that the Terrans were not merely survivors, they were the architects of the Empire's undoing. The galaxy trembled as the Terrans advanced into the very heart of the Vorkan Empire. By now, their presence was not merely a threat at the fringes, it had become a siege upon the Emperor's dominion. His fleets, once perfect instruments of power, were fractured, scattered, and trembling under the pressure of a species that no one had taken seriously. Entire sectors were now dead zones, their orbital defenses silenced by the subtle genius of Terran strategy. Yet even in the midst of this devastation, the humans moved with unerring precision. They did not panic. They did not hesitate. Every strike, every maneuver was calculated to dismantle centuries of imperial arrogance, and the Emperor could only watch in disbelief. The approach to the Emperor's capital system was perilous. Massive gravitational anomalies, radiation belts, and asteroid storms guarded the inner worlds, each obstacle designed by the Vorkan to be lethal to intruders. Yet the Terrans turned every hazard into an advantage. They used the dying sun's solar flares as blind spots, weaving through magnetic turbulence that disabled sensors, and even the Emperor's most sophisticated tracking systems failed to predict their paths. Small Terran vessels darted between colossal orbital platforms, using micro-wormholes and gravimetric shifts to bypass massive gun emplacements entirely. In the Emperor's command center, the screens were a theater of chaos, blackened wrecks of his pride, twisted orbital debris, and streaks of human ships moving like phantoms through it all. The Terrans' methods were as audacious as they were brilliant. Rather than attempting direct assaults on heavily fortified positions, they infiltrated the Empire's command and control networks with nanoscopic probes and quantum scramblers. Communications between dreadnoughts collapsed, sensor feeds flickered, and even the Emperor's personal fleet began to falter as Terran sabotage spread invisibly through energy conduits. What had been a single point of human failure, their relative weakness, became a strength as the Emperor's massive, rigid systems collapsed under the adaptive pressure of Terran ingenuity. Every expectation the Emperor had of victory was subverted. Every plan he executed was anticipated and neutralized with startling efficiency. And yet, the humans' greatest weapon was not their technology, but their adaptability. They learned from every encounter, reshaping their strategy on the fly. One moment, a squadron would appear to retreat, drawing Vorkan fire into a trap. And the next, they would collapse those very forces with precision strikes that dismantled energy conduits, weapon arrays, and propulsion nodes in seconds. The Emperor's own engineers, the finest in the galaxy, could not comprehend the fluidity with which the humans exploited flaws and adapted to new threats. Their thinking was lateral, recursive, relentless. Where the Emperor had assumed linear causality and obedience, the humans found opportunity in chaos, turning disadvantage into advantage with an ease that left even his seasoned admirals paralyzed with disbelief. Within hours, the Emperor's inner systems were under siege. Orbital cities on the capital planets suffered cascading failures. Massive power nodes erupted in flames, and entire civilian populations were forced to flee or hide as human forces moved through the outer orbital rings. The Emperor, seated on his obsidian throne, found himself powerless to command the destruction from afar. Every order he sent was anticipated and undone, every fleet maneuver predicted and neutralized. His arrogance, which had once been absolute, became brittle, splintering under the precision and courage of a species he had mocked. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor felt the primal fear of watching everything he had built crumble despite his authority. The Terrans pressed relentlessly onward, never pausing, never wavering. They exploited the Emperor's overconfidence, drawing dreadnoughts into traps with feigned retreats, collapsing energy barriers with micro-singularities, and detonating carefully placed chain reactions that crippled entire orbital infrastructures. By now, his fleets were in disarray, and his homeworld's defenses, once invincible, were little more than fragile ruins. Each passing moment magnified the Emperor's realization. The Terrans were not simply surviving, they were dismantling the Empire itself, using intelligence, courage, and innovation as weapons far deadlier than any superweapon. And yet, despite the devastation, the Terrans displayed an almost surgical restraint. Their strikes were precise, targeting key infrastructure and strategic assets, while minimizing unnecessary destruction. They understood the theater of war not as a path to mindless annihilation, but as a series of calculated moves, a chessboard in which the Emperor's arrogance was the first pawn to fall. Every calculated strike reinforced the human's message. This species was unlike any the galaxy had encountered, and their ingenuity could topple empires that had never known defeat. By the end of the orbital cycle, the Emperor's throne world was a vision of ruin. Fires burned across cityscapes once thought impregnable. Orbital platforms were shattered remnants, and communications between planets were fractured beyond repair. Even his personal fleet, designed to be the ultimate expression of power, was crippled, immobilized in localized gravitational traps the humans had engineered with subtle brilliance. In the Emperor's throne room, silence fell, punctuated only by alarms and the flickering of failing screens. The reality he had refused to acknowledge was undeniable. The humans had penetrated the core of his empire, and nothing in his experience had prepared him for their cunning. It was in that silence that the Emperor understood the true nature of this species. They were not just fighters, they were thinkers, innovators, and relentless adapters. Every move he had anticipated was countered, every assumption shattered, and the full weight of his miscalculation pressed down upon him like the gravity of a collapsing star. By the time the second night cycle descended over his capital system, the Terrans were already consolidating control over orbital choke points, leaving the Emperor with only one horrifying conclusion. His empire, built over millennia and feared across the galaxy, was now vulnerable to a species he had once dismissed as insignificant. By the fourth orbital cycle, the full weight of the Terran's assault pressed against the Emperor's inner systems. His fleets, once the embodiment of invincibility, were now fragmented skeletons drifting among the wreckage of their own design. Dreadnoughts, colossal vessels that had ruled the void for centuries, floated crippled, their weapons inert, energy conduits severed by Terran sabotage. Entire orbital defense grids had been systematically dismantled, and the very architecture of his command network had been infiltrated by probes too small to detect, too intelligent to counter. Every calculation he made, every contingency he had anticipated, had been outflanked and outmaneuvered. His hubris, once absolute, now seemed almost a liability, a glaring flaw that the humans had exploited with ruthless precision. The Terrans moved not as a single fleet, but as a fluid, omnipresent force. Their vessels weaved through the orbital labyrinth of the Emperor's homeworlds, exploiting weaknesses in the gravimetric fields and magnetic turbulence, their small ships undetectable until it was too late. Where his massive ships relied on raw destructive power, the humans relied on adaptability, creativity, and audacity. One frigate could slip through the gaps of an entire battalion, plant micro-singularities in the energy cores of dreadnoughts, and retreat before the Emperor could respond. Another would redirect energy surges to collapse defensive grids or reroute power into containment failures, triggering cascading explosions that tore apart orbital platforms. The Emperor's eyes, once filled with unshakable confidence, now reflected disbelief and growing panic. He ordered his personal guard, a fleet of the largest, most advanced warships ever constructed, to intercept the Terran advance. These vessels, each bristling with hundreds of devastating energy lances and planetary annihilators, were supposed to be unstoppable. But the humans had anticipated even this. Using complex patterns derived from observational data, the Terran flotilla manipulated the gravitational eddies to turn the Emperor's own weapons against him. Dreadnoughts were pulled into unstable orbits, lances misfired, and colossal explosions shredded fleets that were previously untouchable. Each failed maneuver drove the Emperor further toward desperation. The very instruments of his supremacy became liabilities in the hands of a species he had mocked. In a final act of command, he attempted a direct strike against the Terrans' central formations. Energy beams designed to vaporize entire squadrons were fired from orbit, targeting the vessels with meticulous precision. But the humans had prepared for this. Small intercepting craft manipulated the beams using adaptive reflectors, redirecting them into the Emperor's own orbital installations. Explosions spread like wildfire through his command infrastructure, killing entire crews and destabilizing defensive networks. For the first time in centuries, the Emperor realized that he could no longer rely on technology alone. It was the humans' ingenuity, their courage, and their ability to think differently that had dismantled his empire. The Terrans pressed forward with relentless efficiency. They did not chase glory, nor did they act with cruelty. They acted with purpose. Every strike was calculated, every maneuver precise, every deployment designed to maximize strategic advantage. Where the Emperor had assumed that fear would govern obedience, the humans operated on a principle of intelligence and initiative. Ships that should have been destroyed easily evaded annihilation, returned with countermeasures, and dismantled defenses with surgical precision. They had transformed every flaw, every oversight, and every assumption of the Vorkan into an opportunity. The Emperor's pride was not merely wounded, it was shattered, his empire collapsing from within before the humans had even set foot on his worlds. As the second night deepened over the capital system, the Emperor attempted a final desperate measure. He activated his planetary annihilators, massive devices capable of erasing entire continents in an instant, hoping to wipe out the Terran threat in a single apocalyptic strike. But the humans anticipated this as well. They used the gravitational anomalies, the solar flares, and the very architecture of the planetary defenses to create interference patterns that rendered the annihilators useless. Energy feedback cascaded through the Emperor's systems, triggering catastrophic failures across the orbital network. Cities that had stood for centuries became molten ruins, and dreadnoughts that had never faltered floated inert, crippled by the humans' subtle yet devastating attacks. In the Emperor's command chamber, the horror was complete. His screens displayed devastation he could neither prevent nor comprehend. Fires burned across the throne world, entire orbital cities shattered, and his fleet lay in ruins around him. The humans had done more than destroy ships. They had dismantled the very infrastructure of his empire, proving that domination through fear and brute force could be undone by intelligence, courage, and relentless adaptation. The Emperor, who had once mocked Terrans as insignificant, realized that they had become architects of a new order, a force that would not be denied. By the end of this fourth cycle, the galaxy's perception of power would change forever. The humans had proven that small, determined, and intelligent beings could dismantle the mightiest empire in existence, leaving nothing but ash where arrogance once reigned supreme. The final night over the Vorkon capital system was not quiet. It was the roaring silence of an empire's collapse. Fires engulfed orbital cities, dreadnoughts drifted in shattered constellations, and energy fields, once a symbol of invincibility, flickered and died like dying stars. The Terrans, undeterred and relentless, moved through the Emperor's domain with the precision of a species that had mastered adaptability, courage, and ingenuity. For the first time in the Emperor's millennia of dominion, he was powerless to intervene, watching as the very foundations of his empire burned under the strategic brilliance of a species he had mocked. The Emperor, seated upon the obsidian throne in the central command spire, realized the truth in stark, undeniable clarity. This species would not be intimidated, defeated, or bargained with. His fleets, his defenses, even his planetary annihilators, all instruments of dominion and terror, had been rendered ineffective by intelligence, by courage, and by a relentless refusal to submit. The humans had anticipated every move, exploited every weakness, and converted his pride into the very mechanism of his undoing. The Emperor's arrogance, once a crown of power, had become a noose. Desperate, he attempted one final gambit, a direct deployment of his personal flagship's energy core, designed to obliterate the entire Terran formation in a single cataclysmic strike. The vessels of his admirals, crippled and inert, formed a fractured phalanx around the core, their weapons no longer responding to commands. Yet even this, the Emperor's ultimate weapon, was anticipated. The Terrans' frigates, tiny in comparison but formidable in ingenuity, infiltrated the energy conduit arrays, manipulating gravimetric flows to redirect the Annihilator's force back upon the flagship itself. The explosion, when it came, was catastrophic, but not for the humans. The Emperor's vessel, the symbol of his omnipotence, disintegrated in a cascade of fire and energy, its destruction mirrored across the vacuum of space. His command network collapsed instantly, leaving nothing but debris and the faint, echoing hum of failing systems. The Emperor tried to flee, activating an emergency warp sequence designed to teleport him beyond the reach of the Terrans. But the humans, anticipating this move as they had anticipated every other, had laid a trap. Micro-singularity nets and gravimetric snares ensnared the flagship, preventing escape. The final transmission from the Emperor's vessel was not a roar of defiance, not a declaration of undying power. It was silence. In the span of a single Terran orbital cycle, the ruler who had mocked the galaxy, who had commanded fear and obedience for millennia, had vanished. His empire, once unassailable, lay in ruin, its vast cities and fleets reduced to ash and drifting debris. Humanity, small and underestimated, had accomplished what no one else could imagine. They had turned the Emperor's arrogance against him, dismantled his fleets with precision, and rendered his defenses irrelevant. They had fought not with mindless destruction, but with strategy, courage, and an unwavering commitment to survive and adapt. Where the Vorkon relied on fear, humans relied on foresight and ingenuity. Where the Emperor wielded brute power, humans wielded unpredictability. And in the end, it was the humans' ability to think differently, to innovate under pressure, and to act with resolve that had shattered the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known. The survivors of the Terran fleet hovered silently among the wreckage, their ships battered but intact, moving through the ruins of orbital cities and shattered dreadnoughts. They did not gloat. There was no celebration, no boastful victory parade. Theirs was the quiet satisfaction of a species that had faced insurmountable odds and had not only survived, but triumphed. Every strike, every maneuver, every calculated risk had been a testament to the Terran spirit, intelligent, fearless, and unyielding. Across the void, the galaxy's perception of power would change forever. The small, underestimated species from Sol had rewritten the rules. They had proven that ingenuity, courage, and relentless adaptation could topple an empire that had thought itself eternal. In the aftermath, the Emperor's capital system was silent, except for the drifting fires of destroyed orbital cities and the faint glow of collapsing energy grids. Terran ships patrolled the debris, cataloging wreckage and ensuring no residual threat remained. The galaxy itself seemed to pause, as if acknowledging the unprecedented event, the rise of humanity as a true force among the stars. And from the edge of the system, the final, unmistakable message reached the remains of the Vorkan Empire, broadcast through the silent channels that had once carried the Emperor's arrogance. A simple, resolute statement, written in the actions of a species that refused to be mocked, dismissed, or defeated. By nightfall, the empire of the Vorkan, feared across 1,000 systems and worshipped as unassailable, lay in ruins. The humans, small and resolute, had turned arrogance into ash. They had transformed fear into strategy, mockery into motivation, and the impossible into reality. In the endless void of space, one truth now echoed across the systems that had once trembled at the Emperor's word. The Terrans had come, and nothing would ever be the same again. The galaxy had witnessed the fall of an empire, the collapse of an empire, and the undeniable rise of humanity. And in that moment, in the quiet after devastation, it became clear. The stars were no longer a domain of tyrants. The stars belonged to those who dared, to those who thought differently, and to those who refused to bow. The humans had arrived, and the Emperor's laughter, once a symbol of invincibility, had been replaced by the unyielding truth that courage, ingenuity, and determination could conquer even the mightiest of empires. Humanity had claimed its place among the stars.